History and Current Situation is the title of our panel. And we're happy once again to have our distinguished panel joining us here today. Firstly, our chair or the moderator for this panel is Professor Tan Tai Yong, President of Yale NUS College, Singapore. Can we give him a big warm welcome, please, round of applause. And I say this because some of my veteran is actually here, especially for Hacharan who's listening in. A little bit about Prof. Tan. He once again specializes in South and Southeast Asia and has published extensively on Sikh diaspora, social and political history of the colonial Punjab. Well, our Sikhs has made him an honorary Sikh just a couple of years ago. So give him another big round of applause, please. Prof. Tan, sat sri akal. To be joined once again by Professor Vinita Sinha, Associate Professor from the National University of Singapore. Can we give her a big warm welcome, please? Dr. Rajesh Rai, Associate Professor from National University of Singapore. Can we give him a big warm welcome, please? Tan Sri Professor Dato, Dr. T. Marimutu, Adjunct Professor of the School of Education and Cognitive Sciences, Asian University, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Can we give him a big warm welcome, please? Tan Sri, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. And last but certainly not the least, Dr. Gauri Krishna, Director, DNBG Consultants, former Center Director of India Heritage Center, which I opened with you a couple of years ago, something I'm really honored with. Can we give her a big welcome, please? And with that being said, may I hand the proceedings over to Professor Tan, please.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Good. Welcome to this panel on the diaspora in ASEAN history and current situation. So this is our history session for this PBD. Now, as we celebrate the vibrancy and importance of the Indian diaspora, it is important to realize that this is not a recent phenomenon. The diaspora, if we could use that term, or more accurately, the migration of Indians overseas, and in the context of the event today, to Southeast Asia, has deep historical roots. Relations between India and Southeast Asia started with trade. For centuries, networks sustained by commerce, culture, and community crisscrossed the Indian Ocean, connecting maritime Southeast Asia with the Indian subcontinent. Indian trading communities arrived and established themselves in parts of Southeast Asia as early as the 1800s, and even before. For example, the Cholas have engaged this region at the height of their power in South India. The migration reached a high point when the British Empire held sway in this part of the world. The flow of people, and with that religion, cultures, and ideas have been very much a part of the history of India's long engagements with Southeast Asia. The history is a rich and complex one, and it is important to note that the Indian diaspora is indeed made up of many different communities, each with its own historical trajectories. Today, there are many established communities of Indian origin in different parts of Southeast Asia. They have become very much an integral part of the social and cultural landscape of the region. Singapore offers an excellent example of how members of the diaspora have contributed significantly to building of a new nation, and in the process becoming part of it. For the purpose of today's panel discussion, the panel will outline the historical background of Indian migration to Southeast Asia to better understand the makeup of the Indian diaspora in this region and their current status. Our panel members are all members of the diaspora themselves. All of them have contributed substantially to advancing scholarship on the South Asian diaspora and the promotion of Indian cultural heritage, both in Singapore and in parts of Southeast Asia. So I'm going to introduce them very briefly. You have their full CVs in your book, so I don't need to repeat them. And they will be speaking in order of their surname, alphabetical order of their surname. So our first speaker will be Dr. Gauri Krishnan, Director, DMBG Consultants, and former Center Director, the Indian Heritage Center of Singapore. Now, I want to make a special mention of her work for this very important. She was the builder and the conceptualized and built this very important center, which is Singapore's first museum on the Indian community, and it chronicles the long and multifaceted interactions between South Asia and Southeast Asia from the 19th century to the 21st century. If you have not visited this center, please make an effort to do so. It's really worth the visit. Now, Gauri will be speaking about the social, cultural, religious beliefs and practices gleaned from the epigraphy in Southeast Asia, which shows the presence of a diaspora as early as the 15th century, as well as what Southeast Asian cultures had absorbed from Indic cultures. Our next speaker will be Tan Sri Professor Dr. T. Marimutu, a young professor at the School of Education and Cognitive Sciences, Asia E University in KL, Malaysia. Dr. Marimutu has a long, distinguished academic career as well as a political career. He was chairman of the Asian Institute of Medicine, Science and Technology University in Kedah, and also served with distinction the University of Malaya for 20 years from 1970 to 1990, where he was Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Education, Head of the Department of Social Foundations. He became a Member of Parliament and served as Deputy Minister for Agriculture of Malaysia from 1994 to 95, and he was also appointed to the Senate and served as Chairman of the International Relations Committee of the Malaysian Parliament and President of the Senators Club. He has published very extensively on the field of sociology and education. The third speaker will be Dr. Rajesh Rai, Deputy Head of the South Asian Studies Program at the National University of Singapore. Rajesh works on South Asian diaspora, transnational identities, nationalism, and post-colonial history and politics of South Asia. He was Assistant Director of the Institute of South Asian Studies for a spell, and published recently a very important book on the Indians in Singapore, 1819 to 1945. This book captures the rich history of the Indian diaspora from the beginning of Singapore's British colonial period to the end of the Japanese occupation. So Rajesh will speak broadly on the making of the Indian diaspora in Southeast Asia during the colonial period, with emphasis on Singapore. And last but not least, Professor Vinita Sinha, Head of South Asian Studies Program and also of the Department of Sociology at the National University of Singapore. She has done very extensive work on Hindu religiosity in the diaspora, religion-state encounters, religion commodification and consumption practices, history and practices of sociology. She's a prolific scholar and has published many important books, but I'll just highlight three here. The first, A New God in the Diaspora, Muniswaran Worship in Contemporary Singapore, published in 2005. Next, Religion and Commodification, Merchandising Diasporic Hinduism, 2010. And finally, Religion-State Encounters in Hindu Domains from the Strait Settlements of Singapore, published in 2011. Now, because we only have an hour, I've requested that each speaker be as concise as possible. I've given them approximately 7 minutes, and then that'll leave us some time for Q&A. So without further ado, may I invite Gauri to launch off the discussion. Do you wish to speak from here or from? You'll speak from here. Okay. Over to you, Gauri.
Is it on? Okay. So, yeah, thank you so much, Professor Tan, for this very interesting, chairing this very interesting panel. And I'm really very privileged to be sitting amongst very eminent academics today. And I think it's very important that we start off with the ancient historical context before we move into the contemporary, modern and contemporary context. So my own academic interest is in the ancient period anyway, and I'm an art historian by profession, by training, and a curator by profession. So this is something that I have been interested and have been involved in interpretation of the Indian community's contribution to Southeast Asia, first from the point of view of the Asian Civilizations Museum, and then more recently with the Indian Heritage Center. So with my own interest in what Indians did in Southeast Asia, I have always wanted to go back to the pre-European advent into Asia. And this has been something that many archaeologists and historians have also been interested right from the time of the Dutch, the British, the French scholars, and now the Southeast Asian scholars themselves. And there's a very important period of Indian historians who have also been studying the epigraphy of Southeast Asia, particularly with the focus on Sanskrit and Tamil. and also Brahmi. So moving our focus directly to Singapore and the excavations that have been done in Singapore, we get to know not so much about the inscriptions, because the Singapore stone, the famous carved stone which was found here, is unfortunately undecipherable, but it does give us some insight into the kind of script and language that was used, possibly used by the Sumatrans or the Majapahit kingdom in Southeast Asia. And the recent most excavations have also brought to light carnelian beads, from which we get to know that there definitely was a trading relationship with some of the ports in India. So looking at the the map of India, it would have been better if I had a slide presentation, but since the time is very short, I'm going to just let you imagine that we have the Gujarat coast, the Malabar coast, and the Coromandel coast, and the Bay of Bengal. These are the areas from which most of the trading actually happened between Southeast Asia, South Asia, and West Asia. And this is the time, this is the geography which will keep recurring even in the colonial period from the 16th and 17th century, when the trade becomes very active. But what is more important, and which I keep thinking about, is, was there really a diaspora, as in, did any community go and settle in Southeast Asia? And to that, to that question, the most important example that comes to mind is the excavation done in Bujang Valley in Kedah, where we have not only found foundations of temple structures, but we've also found jetties where there were possibly trade happening, and where vessels used to come and land, where the port exchanged goods. And also there are examples of sculptures and Hindu iconography and Buddhist iconography. More so, there are also inscriptions, such as the Buddha Gupta inscription, which mentions the Buddhist creed, which is a commemoration of a safe journey of a merchant and landing safely in Bujang Valley. So this proves 2 points, that there were definitely merchants who came and went between these regions, and some of them also settled there for the monsoon winds to be suitable to make their journey back to India, to the Coromandel coast, or even to Malabar or Gujarat coast. Talking about what they did, what kind of goods they traded, we are very well aware now through European records that there was an interest in spices and from Southeast Asia, and for which they traded the Indian textiles. So both Gujarat and Coromandel coast has very important textile production of painted and printed textiles, which were coveted by the Southeast Asian polities as well as tribal communities. So there is this very important point to be made here, is that this trade not only accelerated during the arrival of the Europeans, but it was a very well-oiled mechanism of trade way before the Europeans entered this region. The third point which I want to highlight is now from the perspective of religion. And we have the earliest example of written Sanskrit records of Ramayana mentioned in Vietnam from the Vo Can stone stele, which also clearly illustrates that there was not only awareness, but also interest in inscribing the Ramayana text. And the earliest example in sculptural form comes from the Prambanan temples, where the largest ever narrative of the Ramayana can be seen on the temple walls of Prambanan in 9th century. And this is something which is so unique, because there's no mention or representation of Ramayana at such an extensive scale in any part of India. So the importance of Ramayana and the two epics, Mahabharata, is again very important from both epigraphical point of view as well as cultural point of view. I will not be able to go into the details of how it is popularized, even performing arts and literary arts, even till today. But I'm sure most of you are aware that Ramayana still exists in the psyche of the Southeast Asian as a living heritage of the region. Do I have one more minute? Okay, so I want to touch on Islam now, and that is one point that brings me back to the region of Indonesia and Malaysia, and the importance of the role of Gujarat. I haven't touched even on the Cholas and the Pallavas and the expedition from the two regions and the context of Chinese trade and the role of Southeast Asia and its connection with India, because there's a new research done on excavations by scholars in India, and Noboru Karashima has written extensively on potsherds as well as ceramics and epigraphy, which highlights the fact that there was a very well-oiled trade in Chinese ceramics with, through Southeast Asia between India and China. So going back to the point about Islam, after which I'll round off, is the importance of the Hadrami tradition of Islam coming into Java, that is Aceh, and also into Malaysia from Gujarat. And this is a very important contribution of a Gujarati scholar of Hadrami descent, Nuruddin Raniri. He was from Randir. Raniri refers to a port city or port town in Surat in Gujarat. And this was also a very important trading port. And through that also we find Islamic traditions entering into Southeast Asia. And one of the examples can also be found in the tombstones, which have been excavated at Gresik in East Java and at Samudra Pasai in Sumatra from the 1428 to 1460, that is 15th century, that highlights the importance of Islamic traditions arriving into Southeast Asia through Gujarat coast. So I've given you a quick snapshot of the various trajectories and various areas in which there has been contact. However, it is very difficult to establish any communities that lived there until, of course, we get the Malacca reference of Tome Pire, who mentions that there were Gujarati Shabandar and almost 1,000 Gujarati traders living in Malacca. But that is from the European records. So I think I'll end here.
Thank you, Gauri. You've managed to compress 400, 500 years of history in about 7 minutes. Thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be questions, and she'll be happy to take questions later on. I next invite Professor Marimutu. You want to speak from the... Yeah, please. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Professor Tan and members of the panel, and ladies and gentlemen. Being an ex-politician, I like the mic. That's a joke. Anyway, I think one of the panel members, Gauri, has given a historical account. It was the Prime Minister of, the ex-Prime Minister of India, Dr. Manmohan Singh, in one of his inaugural addresses of the PBDs in New Delhi, talked about the history of diaspora and divided into 3 categories. That is the emigration of Indians across the seas from ancient times, which Gauri has touched about. And they are the ones who traded. They were the traders looking for gems, various spices and metals and so on. And they also helped to form empires, particularly in Southeast Asia. My question is, when we visit all these countries, many of the countries are very excited as well as very proud of the heritage, of the Hindu heritage. But some countries are in a denial mode, and you know which are the countries they are. And the second wave is the colonial wave, where the British India supplied cheap labor to the colonies, stretching from the far-flung Caribbean islands right through South Africa to Malaysia, Singapore, and to Fiji. And these were the bulk of us who are here or in Singapore are the product of this colonial diaspora. The third one is the new wave, or the global Indian, who are recently, from after the colonial period, they have been both in the West as well as in the East, contributing to the socio-economic development, ICT, engineering, and so on and so forth. And even one researcher called them as IT coolies, because the second colonial wave was the shipment of coolies, cheap coolies, to the various colonies. So my focus will be, since it's only about 7 minutes, I will just take a case study of Malaysia as an example, a case study of an example of the colonial diaspora. The wave of emigration to the British colonies to Malaysia occurred in the 19th and the 20th centuries. Particularly early 19th centuries, the British colonials imported cheap labor to work in first of all, in the spice gardens, the next continuing coffee plantations, and finally the rubber plantations in about 1890. And it's called the rubber rush. And these were they had a system called the indentured labor system, where the agents went to India and went to the villages, promised them heaven and earth, and the country that you're going will be flowing with milk and honey. But when they came in here, of course, they had a very hard life. So that's how the Malaysians, the diaspora in Malaysia has been formed in the 1820s, 1830s, and so on, 1890s, the rubber boom. We had the indentured system. It was abused so much so that the indentured system was replaced by the Kangani system. The Kangani system is a foreman who goes to the village and talks to his relatives or caste members and then brought them back to work in the plantations. And this also had severe problems, and then it was abolished much later. So with the rise of the rubber industry, it also was important to develop the transport and communication system in the country. Therefore, the Malaysian government at that time recruited not the laborers, but also the educated immigrants. And that is how we got the bulk. If you talk about Malaysia, 80% of the population, Indian population, are Tamils. That is because there was the agents were not allowed to recruit in any other part of India except for South India. That shows why there are Tamils and Malayalis and Telugus and Sikhs and Gujaratis came later to trade and to develop commerce. And the question that has been asked even by Gauri is, this population is a transient population. They are circulatory migration. That is, they come, they work for 3 to 5 years, and then they go off. And this is how, even in historical period, how is that they were able to build temples and such structures like Angkor Wat and Borobudur and the likes, because there must have been some resident population. But insofar as Malaysia is concerned, the resident population has been here, but the resident population only began about 1930s because of the depression. Many were sent back, the others were left here, and therefore they continue to live here. But by 1957, we are already showing the characteristics of a resident population, because when the immigrants came, the whites did not come. They were they were not allowed to bring in the wives because they just wanted the males. Because the sex ratio was unbalanced, at a certain point, they said, when they recruit the new recruit, they were allowed, they cannot be bachelors. Only 1 in 5 can be a bachelor. That means the sex ratio became normalized, and therefore it became a resident population. The other point that I should make is the Tamils and the Telugus were preferred because they were told to be very docile, hardworking, easier to recruit, and easily manageable, not rebellious, because they took the Chinese workers, they were very rebellious, asked for more pay. Therefore, they did not want, they wanted these docile Tamil workers to be here. But the human agency showed after 1940s, after the war, because during the war, Subhash Chandra Bose, who came here in Singapore, made a very moving speech. And that was, for the Indians, the diverse Indians came together. The middle class and the linguistically separated Indians came together. The unity was there because of Subhash Chandra Bose. There were several factors that explained that they were no more docile. After the Second World War, they started to push for better wages and so on. A series of trade unions strikes were there for demanding better pay. In the earlier period, especially in Singapore, we not only recruited workers for the plantations. When Francis Light founded Penang and Stamford Rifles founded Singapore, they had to have officers. And the officers and workers and domestic servants came with the convicts as well as slaves. But today, the minister talked about the contribution of the people who came. And the convicts were the ones who built the government house, the Mariamman temple, and many put on the roads and constructed many of the road systems. Therefore, but they were sent back by 1867. Now, finally, in terms of the Bojang Valley, just make this Bojang Valley, this thing, and I finish. The relationship between Chola Empire and the Srivijayan Empire has been quite friendly in the early years of Rajaraja Cholan. Kadaram, the Kedah, the capital of Srivijaya, was sacked by King Rajendra Cholan and put somebody else who will be more more subservient to Chola kingdom. And just the Bojang Valley is located in very near Ames University, and maybe Ames University in a year's time will also be a historical artifact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri Prof. Again, a very rich history, but sorry we have to condense it in such a short time. Our next speaker is Prof. Rajesh Rai, and he's going to talk about the diaspora in colonial period with emphasis on Singapore. Over to you, Rajesh.
Thank you.
Can I speak from here?
No, I'm fine, I think. Thank you, Prof. Tan, who happens to be my teacher, although he doesn't look it. In about 9 or 10 days, I'll be meeting a new batch of students. And for a course on the Indian diaspora. So we do have a course on the Indian diaspora, in fact 3 courses at different levels at the National University of Singapore. And for the first year, students, when they come in, just to gauge the extent of knowledge, I usually have a quiz. And my first question is, which country hosts the largest Indian diaspora? And, you know, students have laptops in front of them and they quickly Google, and at least half the class will tell me the United States. That's the contemporary situation. So I raised it up a bit and I asked them a second question. So which country had the largest Indian diaspora prior to the Second World War? So here we have a problem because not many students actually know the answer of that. Perhaps one in the class. I'll give you all a hint. It's connected to a song in a 1949 Hindi movie called Patang. And the song goes, Mere piya gaye Rangoon, wahan se aaya hai telephone. Burma, Myanmar had the largest Indian diaspora prior to the Second World War. Over 1 million people. It comes as a shock to many of you perhaps as well. Indeed, prior to the Second World War, 50% of the Indian diaspora was located in Southeast Asia. Today, it's perhaps between 22 and 25%, depending on how you define diaspora and so on and so forth. Now, what I want to focus on in this session is really on the makings of this very large diaspora that emerged in Southeast Asia during the colonial period. Gauri has spoken about the ancient period, and we acknowledge that even as that influence was tremendous, the numbers were very small in terms of settled population. A change occurs after the advent of British colonial control, so that large populations from India began to move to Southeast Asia, to Burma, Malaya, to Singapore, but as well in smaller numbers to Indonesia, to the Philippines, and via the French control ports also to French Indochina, and so on and so forth. Now, I want to mark out a few ways in which the diaspora here was quite distinctive, and I want to focus on Singapore per se. You have, on the one hand, a situation in which Singapore is located in an area that has ancient connections with South Asia. You have, as well, an old diaspora that was forged out of colonial capital. But in Singapore, you have also now a very, can say, a fairly large numbers as well of new diasporas who have emerged over the last 15, 20 years. Indeed, Singapore is perhaps the only city that has a demographic dimension like this. If you look at the number of Indians on the ground in Singapore, it's about 600 to 700,000. Half of these comprise the old diaspora. Half of these are made up of the new diaspora. And so I think this makes it a very interesting place. This is quite unlike any other place in the world. In the West, that movement is after the Second World War. In the Caribbean, it's only the diaspora of colonial capital. So I want to mark out some aspects of that distinctiveness in the colonial period. Firstly, this was a very diverse populace. It is true that Tamils comprised the largest numbers. It was somewhat different perhaps in the port cities like in Singapore, in Penang, in Rangoon, where you had slightly greater diversity of populations in terms of ethno-linguistic difference, but also in terms of occupational types. So in Singapore, for example, you had Tamil Muslims from the Coromandel coast who moved very quickly to the colony here. You had Chettiars and Parsis and Gujarati merchants coming in. You had Sindhis who came here certainly by increasing numbers from the 1860s onwards. Not so much because they wanted to sell something here, but because as they moved out to the empire, they needed to import items from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and so they needed bases in this area. And this brought them to this region in the 1860s. We have spoken also about another occupational type, the laborers who moved here. One group, as mentioned by Tan Sri, were the transported convicts, whose contributions were massive in the early development of the city. Paradoxically, these were people who found considerable freedom here and sometimes were used as policemen to control secret societies. You had laborers who came in through the indenture, Kangani, and Maestri system. Again, the port cities had somewhat differentiated experience as well in this regard, because here you also had a contract labor system which is somewhat less studied, and perhaps we can talk a little more about that. By the 1860s, 1870s, you had educated personnel coming in alongside Sikh policemen who arrived here in 1881, and educated personnel, well, from Sri Lanka, but later from Kerala as well, who came in as teachers and so on. So you have a very diverse ethno-linguistic community forming here. Now, the other way in which the history of the diaspora here, and I'll make this point and I'll end off, is quite different from many parts of the world, even in the case of those who came during the colonial period, is as follows. If you look at much of the literature on the Garmitya diaspora or the indentured diaspora, the emphasis is on rupture. The emphasis on people who have been cut off from the motherland, based in the Caribbean, for example. And a lot of that literature has influenced the way we have looked at the old diaspora. One of rupture, one of nostalgia. I think Southeast Asia, and especially the port cities of Southeast Asia, were quite different. I think you will find that this region was far more connected. Far more connected, so that when social and political reform movements emerged in India, they had a bearing on this part of the world. Okay? We know great notables like Nehru, for example, or Shastri arrived in Singapore. We know, for example, that Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore came here in the 1920s. Perhaps less of you know that Swami Vivekananda, before his 1893 address in Chicago, also arrived in Singapore. So in this region, you had a persistent influence of the social and political currents that were emerging out of India. And this had an impact on our identity. So much so that when the Second World War breaks out, and when Subhash Chandra Bose reaches out to the people of Singapore, the Indian diaspora here, he finds tremendous support, because this is a recognized leader, and people would be willing to die for the motherland. I think I want to end off by just making way into the present, which is something that Vinita will focus on, by saying that there is a change that occurs as these states become independent. Perhaps some aspects of that connectivity for 25, 30 years after that independence period comes to be disrupted, where nation building, and sometimes a jealous nation building, demands complete loyalty and a disconnect from the homeland. In some cases, it leads to expulsion, as in Burma, of large numbers of Indians. But we find again today, over the last 30 years, new connections emerging. And on that exciting topic, I think I'll leave it to Vinita to carry on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rajesh. So we now invite Vinita to take us to the contemporary, the current status of the diaspora. Vinita, over to you.
Thank you, Tayong. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to the panelists. I'm very delighted to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this very important panel. I should say that I am part of the diaspora myself, having arrived in Singapore in 1974 as a 12-year-old. with my father, who came to teach at the then Nanyang University in the Communications and Media Department. So I'm very much a part of the diaspora that I'm going to talk about, and I've lived here continuously for all these years, and I've also had the good fortune of actually studying the Indian diaspora as well as Hinduism, but of a different kind, because as a Hindi-speaking Bihari, I have learned Tamil to understand Tamil Hinduism, which is what is the dominant mode here. So I'm very happy to speak to the contemporary situation. We've already heard from the panelists the importance of history. I think it's fitting that as the last speaker, I should bring us to the present, because we do want to discuss and confront some of the challenges that are facing Indian communities in the diaspora. Indian diaspora is the largest in the world, as we all know, and post-World War II, there is about, I think, 25% of the Indian diaspora in Southeast Asia and the Asean region, ranging from about 2 million in Malaysia to a few hundred in places like Laos and Cambodia, right? So that's the kind of spread. And then in between, you have Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, with a few 100,000, and Singapore, of course, having a fairly large Indian diasporic population, which is a very layered population, which is what I want to talk about. One of the points I think I want to note is that migration of Indians into this region has actually never stopped. I mean, we speak of periods of history where migration and flows and movements have become intensified for various reasons, but it's actually never stopped. There's been a continuous movement of Indians of various categories from different parts of India coming to different parts of Southeast Asia. And certainly in the mid-70s, I was part of that wave of migration. And even since the 70s to date, this flow of Indians into the region has not stopped, right? It just kind of changes its shape and size over time. So I want to speak specifically to the contemporary situation in Singapore, but I want to pick up on the point that Rajesh made about connectivity, and I think it's a very important point to note, which also marks the diaspora, Indian diaspora in Southeast Asia quite distinctly, especially if you compare it to Indian diasporic communities in places like South Africa or Suriname or Mauritius or Fiji, where you have 7 generations, of Indians there who have never visited India, right? I mean, they really don't have this sense of connectivity. Part of it, of course, has to do with physical distance and difficulty of travel, etc. But if you look at the Indian diaspora in Southeast Asia, there has been a very strong sense of connectivity, both to a kind of cultural heritage of India, as well as the possibility of physically going back to your homes or villages to visit for various reasons. And I think that notion of connectivity is really important, which marks the diaspora in very distinct ways. Now, this for overseas Indians, both the recognition of links with India and a disconnect from India can and have been politicized, and that's the point I want to make. For settled communities, being described or mistaken as migrants or as part of the diaspora are seen to delegitimate claims to citizenship rights and entitlements. Indeed, this misrecognition has been the basis for tensions and conflicts between members of the old and new diaspora in various Southeast Asian countries, and certainly in Singapore. This is something we have seen quite clearly. So let me speak specifically to the Singapore scene now. The last 3 decades have marked a critical phase in the history of the Indian community in Singapore. It is during this period that a new category of Indians accepted the Singapore government's invitation to come to Singapore, some with the intention of settling roots here, but others after many years still in a sojourning mood. These arrivals added to a settled older Indian diaspora and a more recent base of Indian foreign workers who have had a continuous presence in Singapore as labor. These laborers have been less resented by Singapore Indians, generally speaking. In recent years, the dichotomy of Singapore Indians and Indian Indians mapping onto belabored notions of old and new diasporas have been invoked to describe the diversity within the Indian community. Collectively, Indians have reconfigured the demography and profile of the local Indian community, socially, culturally, and economically. There is a view that there are foundational cultural differences between Singapore Indians and Indian Indians, and that both groups can easily recognize and identify the other. This is a complex issue and warrants further reflection and should not lead to simplistic conclusions. At the same time, the discourse of difference, conflict, and tensions amongst the new in this community has emerged. Ironically, while migrants from India were quoted by the Singapore government for their presumed ethnic sameness, their presence has in fact introduced an element of cultural difference into Singapore's multiracialism. So new and continuing arrivals have reconfigured Indian community demography, profile, and internal political balance. For instance, the influx of a critical mass of North Indian migrants recently has altered the numerical size and strength of the ethno-linguistic groups in Singapore. This has further transformed the linguistic landscape and produced language shifts within. Tamil remains, of course, one of the 4 official languages in Singapore, but is now positioned alongside several other Indian languages. The differences between new Indian migrants and old settled segments of the community have been noted by all parties. Critical questions have surfaced about how non-Indian Singaporeans now view members of the Indian community. The presence, yet again, of South Asian males engaged in manual labor refreshes historical memories, mapping onto the past of Indian labor migration in colonial British Malaya. What bucks the trend and does not fit the stereotype are perhaps the large numbers of middle class, upper middle class Indians in Singapore whose conspicuous consumption marks them as different from the familiar and typical profile of Singaporean Indians. Possibly the enhanced class gaps within the community have surfaced as the most critical divide. But there is evidence of interface and encounters between the different segments of the new reconfigured community. This is seen in social, cultural, religious, educational sites where interactions bridge members' varied historical experiences of being a migrant. These exchanges occur through modes that demonstrate converging experiences and interests, including sites like places of worship, workplaces, living spaces, schools and universities, markets, malls, movie theaters, and arts venues, which bring together both members of the old and new diaspora. But it has also been suggested that they might be, in the coming of new Indians, a return to older, discarded cultural and customary practices deemed now unsuitable for structuring social life in Singapore. Some areas of concern that have been articulated include, for example, a return to caste identities or caste-related practices, a reassertion of caste hierarchies, excessive ritualism in temples, or reinforcing of popular Hinduism through foreign worker involvement in its ritual complex. In general, Singaporeans have critiqued what is perceived as the government's red carpet treatment of foreign talent, including Indian foreign talent. Now, thus far, the economic and class dimensions of Indian foreign talent have drawn the greatest critique. But it's a timely reminder that class stratification within the contemporary Indian community has not been created for the first time through these arrivals, but actually have a much longer history in Singapore. The notice of class stratification within the community has generated a particular kind of politics, including producing narratives about what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be a foreigner, and what are their rights and entitlements. While attitudes to foreigners are mediated by class, there is some double standards on the part of Singaporean Indians themselves who seem to accept Indian cheap labor and its presence in Singapore, but their visibility in Singaporean public social life has triggered troubling and hypocritical reactions from local Indians and other Singaporeans. Middle-class Indian and other migrants are seen as competing with citizens for jobs, housing, places in schools, transportation, etc. The more affluent Indian arrivals stand out for their earning capacity and consumption lifestyles. And these responses carry embedded critique of government policies and lack of adequate planning and preparation of infrastructure to receive this large inflow of migrants into the country. The charge of xenophobia directed at Singaporeans is somewhat simplistic and reductionist, although As a partial solution from the Singapore end, calls have been made for foreigners to be more like us and learn our ways if they want to live amongst us. This language of integration and cultural assimilation is essentially hegemonic, operating within a discursive frame that privileges citizenship rights and obligations above all other identities. And this has generated a politics of exclusion, which is reflected concretely in physical, moral, and political containment of Indian foreign workers, as well as the self-barricading of Indian foreign talent in new migrant enclaves. And both of these produce social disengagement from the local Indian community and other locals. Now, perhaps to end on a more positive note, Indian communities overseas have constituted themselves in ways that have allowed them to sustain energetic manifestations of community life beyond Indian shores. They have built families and communities, sustained languages and art forms, etc. In the contemporary Singaporean context, a move towards the politics of inclusion requires, I think, for all parties to transcend a very sharp local-foreign divide which has emerged within the community, and to transcend differences and privilege other identities and make connections across cultural, linguistic, religious, and other boundaries. In my view, there's every reason for optimism given that there is a long history of the Indian diaspora making very strong connections with indigenous communities wherever they have gone, and I very much hope that happens in Singapore. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vinita. Right, we've heard 4 very rich papers. I've got about 10, 12 minutes left for Q&A, so I'm going to start inviting questions from the floor. Please keep your questions as concise as possible. Maybe I'll take 3 at one go so that we can then have a good discussion before we go on to the next 3. I see the person at the back, and then you, sir, and then you, this side. So we'll take the first 3. I think the one at the back, and then you, and...
So it's going to be the gentleman here?
Yeah, I think he will be number 2. And then there's a gentleman at the end.
Okay, my question is very specific to Dr. Gauri. You were talking about Bujang Valley. So I have also been to that place. And about a few years ago, on the banks of the river Sungai Muda, they have excavated new places. And these are similar to the Buddhist structures. So I have also visited many of the Mauryan structures, especially in Lumbini, Nalanda, and other places. So I found them similar to that. So have they done any development studies on this, and have they established a period on this? That is one basic question.
Okay.
Because we are still not clear which period it will have been. But Mauryan period we know, to the Gupta period we know it's from 2nd BC to the 3rd AD. Okay, most of the structures, of the Buddhist structures in India are of this period. Okay, that's the first question. Coming to the second one, how is the Pallava kingdom related to Angkor Wat? Are they really related? Because we find the similar names like Nandivarman, Jayavarman, Narasimhavarman, the same names are also mentioned in the Angkor Wat temples. I also visited that place and I found those names there. But did they speak the same language? Because we understand that it is not the language which existed in Tamil Nadu during that time. The Pallava kings were from Tamil Nadu, and they are referred as that they are foreigners by certain scholars. And one of the leading author is Dr. Aravanan, who has written a book, and he has mentioned that he is a foreigner, that the Pallava kings came from a different place. They did not inherit from Tamil Nadu. And is there any similarity between those structures, or are the Pallavas the one who built those temples? These are the 2 questions.
Okay, so Bujang and the Pallavas, sir.
Good afternoon, my name is Ram N. Kumar, and I'm from New Delhi. I work in the area of Ayurveda. So I was going through the various studies done in Singapore. I'm talking about modern history, not the ancient history, which I'm not privy of. So I have realized that the Ayurveda and other institutes of medicine has been mainstream, and government of Singapore indeed included those systems as part of textbook. And it says that Ayurveda originated in India. It also talks about surgeries and everything. So how do you relate the relationship between India and Singapore from the perspective of medicine, where the textbooks are also talking about that, and they have been supportive of? So do you think the such initiatives can take both these countries forward and I would say a long-lasting relationships?
So Ayurvedic medicine and traditions, maybe one of you can take this, you too if you want to. Sir?
Hello.
Yeah.
Very good afternoon, dear panel members. I'm R.K. Ramanikrishnan from Malaysia. We have learned that many Asian countries reach with Hindu-Buddha civilization and cultural identity in socio-political elements. History remains history. History remained history. Research and studies were conducted, but the legacy were not determined. I believe it's a total failure. It also because of colonialism and imperialism, and the Indians missed out the industrial revolution and impact of globalization. What are the proposals and recommendations from panel members to continue our historical legacy for further excellence and to face the contemporary challenges? Thank you.
So the question is how can the Indian communities continue to flourish, and what are the opportunities and what can be done to help them flourish and prosper? Is that
Not
your
only
question?
that, how we can extend ourselves to bring more excellence. If
Okay.
not, we only see the artifact and then old buildings and temples.
Okay. All right, we'll try to answer
Thank
your
you.
question. So I think, Gauri, you start with Bujang and Pallavas, and then Ayurveda, and then after that, generally about how to do better, and then the community can do better.
Is it done? Okay. So the question on Pallava connection with Angkor Wat first. So from the inscriptions that we have found and that have been translated thus far, there's no recorded mention of Pallava period inscriptions, and also the belief that Pallavas built Angkor Wat is totally wrong. And I think in today's day and age, this is something which has been already addressed by many scholars, that there could be Indian sthapatis, that means architects and sculptors, who would have been part of the team which built Angkor Wat, but they are not built by Indians. They are built by Angkor, that is Khmer sculptors and artisans, and the patronage is from the Khmer rulers. So that is, there's no issue on that point. The other point about Bujang Valley connections with Buddhist architecture in India, I think more research has to come out, and I know that the Malaysian scholars are working on it, but there is no, again, definitive information that has been either published or presented in any conferences so far. But yes, with Sungai Mas and the documentation of the site around Sungai Mas, we do know that the history can go back way beyond the Sri Vijaya period. So how far it can go back is again something to be ascertained by the scholars. But we can comfortably come to the beginning of the current era in linking the connections. But there is definitely no established knowledge so far about Mauryan connection. That much I can say. But yes, early Buddhist, and that is Theravada Buddhist connections are definitely there.
Okay, so
Yes, I'll take up the question together with Rajesh. We'll also talk about this, about Ayurveda. So, of course, in Singapore, you know, the system of medicine that's legally and legitimately recognized is allopathic medicine, which is Western biomedicine. But nonetheless, there are many different types of medical systems that exist in the country, which are associated with different ethnic groups. So you have the traditional Chinese medicines, and you certainly have Ayurveda here. So when the Indian migrants came to Singapore and Malaya, British Malaya, they brought many things with them. One of them included their forms of traditional healing, right? So, in fact, in Singapore, there's a very, very famous Ayurvedic physician who's recently passed away, who had a practice, and he used to serve members of the community. But Ayurveda actually exists in Singapore in the domestic realm through families, knowledge that families have, particularly families from Kerala, about how to heal using particular kinds of remedies. So it's very much, it has a presence, as does homeopathy actually. So, medicines and forms of healing were brought by migrants themselves, and even though they were not institutionalized as legal medical systems, they very much exist as everyday healing practices within the home, within families, which have this tradition. I'm sure this is an area that could be developed further to, and in fact, lots of Indians travel from here to Kerala for various kinds of Ayurvedic treatment. There's medical tourism that takes place, and people do bring back their various kashayams and layams for treatment. So I think there's a lot of working knowledge about Ayurveda within the Indian community here, and also it's a system of medicine that is used at an everyday life level. Thank you. There are a couple of Ayurvedic physicians who are registered, but they are not allowed to call themselves medical doctors under Singapore law, right? But they can be registered, and they are, in fact, many of them now functioning, just as homeopaths and traditional Chinese physicians are. So there is the biomedicine doctors who are medically, legally allowed to use MD, and then there are the others who are legally not allowed to use MD. But they exist. I mean, they are legal. They're not illegal. They're just not considered medical doctors. But Rajesh has more to say on this.
No, I think there's not much more that I can add, except that it's grown rapidly over the last few years. In the way we go past Racecourse Road, for example, you have now 5 on that road itself. So it's grown rapidly. It's governed by certain rules. One thing that makes Singapore open to these ideas is because traditional Chinese medicine exists. And thus, Ayurveda is accepted as an alternative form, and many people do turn to that. But there are certain medicines, of course, you need to get it approved by the ministry for those medicines to be brought. Some of those medicines are not, that is used in Ayurveda in India, are not allowed here. So this is an issue. Some people who are in search of those type of medicines also go to India. So I don't think there's much more I can add. We can have a chat about this later. Yeah.
I think the question is, how do you excel? We have a very illustrious heritage. By thinking of the illustrious heritage alone, we cannot excel. We can excel through education if we have the opportunity. If you take the Malaysia as an example, the Indian community, you know that 60-70% of the community was locked up in the green ghettos, in the plantations. They were like a total institution, like prisons. You can't get out of these plantations. So, therefore, they did not have the opportunity. The education system then was meager just to make them to learn how to read and write so that they will become better tappers in the plantation. Therefore, I think we have a good heritage. We have a very illustrious heritage. But based on that, we have the human agency to excel. For the human agency to excel, you must have the opportunities. Now I think the majority of the population, the Indian population, has come out of the plantations, and they are in the urban areas. They have got access to the amenities and the educational facilities. Therefore, they can excel. And you know that the Indians are excelling in Malaysia. Given the opportunity, they will fly and soar high. Thank you.
I see one hand there. I'm just going to, I think that has to be the last question because I've been signaled already. So maybe Prakash, to you. So I'm sorry, we've run out of time, but I'm sure the panelists would be happy to stand at the corner of the room afterwards to take some more questions, right? You all have agreed, huh? Okay, good.
Hi, this is Prakash from National University of Singapore. I'm just taking forward that question, but it's not related to Ayurveda. From a public health point of view, how the medical or disease demography or prevalence of diseases and government policies are made based on the Indian diaspora present here. because this may have major implications in government spending as well as how we practice health, public health issues as well.
So that's a comment, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe it's a new point to take care of in the future, probably.
Because Prakash is a doctor in Singapore, so I think we have to end. I'm sorry. Because I think there's another panel coming up, right? Yeah. So, well, I think that's all the time. Yeah, we'll take the questions offline afterwards, so we'll just stand at the corner. Well, it leaves me to thank our panelists for giving us such a rich coverage of historical and contemporary issues related to the diaspora. And from what we've heard today, it's obviously an ongoing story. There are lots of interesting twists and turns, and it's not completed yet. But obviously, the kinds of connectivity that Rajesh talked about will be something that would be important to build upon, and this could be something that would strengthen relations between Southeast Asia and India. And on that note, I leave it back to the MC.